Good morning and welcome to our sixth Acknowledging and Confronting Our History conversation with clergy. I'm Chris Faison and I'll be facilitating today. So I will share the slides with you. Okay, so we are looking at the last time period that we'll be covering, and I entitled it Post-Racialism in the 21st Century. And our term for the day, or quote actually for the day, is a quote by Ibram Kendi. To be anti-racist is a radical choice in the face of history, requiring a radical reorientation of our consciousness. And I know Wes referenced that book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, last week, so we'll be looking at that quote in particular. So in thinking about the last couple of decades, I wanted to start with an early example regarding housing. So university students' off-campus housing and their impact on affordable housing options were challenged 2 decades ago. What purposeful strategies can we employ to address this persistent issue today? So in September 2000, students living off campus were limiting options for needy residents of Chapel Hill. The town council hired 2 planning experts to revise the town's development ordinance, which set regulations for residential construction and zoning. There was a 1981 ordinance that needed simplification and clarification, so another kind of 20-year period before that. Families were finding it difficult to compete, as they still are, with 6 to 8 students with 4 cars, and the quote was 4 cars and 2 kegs. It was hard to compete with that. And the possible solution was to steer students to housing closer to campus, where they wouldn't necessarily need a car and they wouldn't disturb neighbors with children. Their combined buying power was a problem for working families, and it was said that many parts of town already had regulations for reserving neighborhoods for families. But the general rule was that, as many of you are aware, that if there were more than 4 unrelated people, that does not qualify as a family. So also into September 2000, Chapel Hill residents demanded input in UNC's master plan, which was a blueprint for campus growth. So that was a kind of an interesting parallel time. The previous spring, during a planning meeting, I had a chance to be on the student advisory committee to the board of trustees, and I was the only person to mention diversity in this 100-year plan. It didn't come up at all, and found that ironic, but it's also consistent with some of the history we've been learning over the few weeks. And I also wanted to reference Yanni Chapman, the researcher who wrote a very controversial dissertation on race and its links to the history of the university and the town. And he, toward the end of his study, he references dismantling a racially demeaning labor caste that UNC helped to create. So that directly connects to our issue around affordable housing and housing discrimination. So our next question: the Apple Chill Festival eventually ended due to high costs, violence, and heavy traffic. What unspoken racial considerations undergird these contributing factors? So many people are also aware this began some time ago in 1972, a time when the city was, quote, a town of small, even shops, interrupted by one higher roof with the unmistakable air of village compactness and tradition, end quote. It was a springtime festivity that a lot of other towns had, where they closed traffic. Franklin Street was closed to traffic. It was a large street fair that brought thousands of people into town, provided exposure for artists and musicians of all types. It began to change, and the 3 issues that are referenced again around high costs, violence, and bad traffic emerged. In 2004, the celebration cost approximately $43,000, and it doubled a year later to $87,000 for police and other costs. Rising crime led to increased police. As I mentioned, 2003, they witnessed a dozen fights that were reported, and then the following year, there were 2 people injured in a stabbing at the local 506 establishment. So by 2006, the final year, there were 30,000 participants, as many as 235 police. There were 11 arrests and 87 traffic citations. At an unsanctioned event called After Till, 3 people were shot, and one observer says that the main reason why the event, within or without the event known as After Till, when thousands of young, mostly Black men from all over the state came to town in souped up cars and brightly colored motorcycles, cruising the streets in a parade that lasted into the evening. Personally, I liked After Chill, though I think it would be better not as a Black event, but for whites, Hispanics, and anybody else with an interest in cars and motorcycles. The quote goes on to say that, and even though they don't have Apple Chill any longer, every year they still hold Festival, which is the same thing, really. In fact, I don't know why the bikers and car dudes don't just come for that. Whoops, did I say something wrong? So it's evident that Chapel Hill was no longer a smaller town, and the mayor at the time, Kevin Foy, was forced to acknowledge that fact, even with facing resistance from many locals. And the town is not the same as it was. He quotes that the town is not the same as it was 35 years ago. As the town grows, as the region grows, we have to be willing to change with it. So that's our second question to consider. And then the last one, The Shame of College Sports in 2011 by Taylor Branch references, quotes, the plantation, well-meaning paternalists, and the colonized. How can we radically reorient our consciousness with respect to the effect of college sports on our local community? So Taylor Branch, of course, is an alum. He graduated in 1968, famous for his documentary of MLK's time as a civil rights leader. Um, he and his books on that, he basically helps within a year of our own scandal that breaks in 2010. The following year, he talks about how the US is the only country that has big time sports in higher education, serving as a minor leagues of sorts. It deprives due process for students. He mentions that you catch the unmistakable whiff of the plantation. It's imposed by well meaning paternalists and rationalized statements caring for the well being of the colonized. The following year, in the fall of 2012, Reginald Hildebrand wrote an essay on the anatomy of a scandal. He's a now retired faculty from the African American Studies Department and also History departments. And also happened to be my mentor, major mentor in AAAD. He basically says that race is the whale that has been swimming just below the surface during this whole travail, even though many observers insist that it is not there. For the most part, we were talking about Black athletes in the Department of African and African American Studies. His final quote says that I wanted to reference is that questions about the integrity with which we teach seamlessly slide into questions about the legitimacy of what we teach and even a few judgmental assumptions about who we teach. So I thought that was a great way to encapsulate a faculty member's idea of what was happening. And then finally, 2 years later, as the scandal was starting to crest, in October 2014, the Weinstein report concludes, and there was a rally that was held at the steps of South Building by co-hosts the Real Silent Sam Coalition and Black Student Movement. And their mission for the rally was to challenge the media's vilification of the AAAD department and the systematic exploitation of athletes. The students adeptly talk about how athletes were not seen as intellectual beings, but more as commodities bought, sold, primped, propped for profit of the more powerful. And they also adeptly recognize that these young men in particular were passed through middle and high school to compete athletically, but they get here struggling and placed in situations like these. So I think those were good ways to help frame the way that people were responding to this issue. So going back to our quote, again, Ibram Kendi, he actually spoke at Carolina in February 2019 for our African American history lecture. And I hope some people were able to attend that. And he basically says that to be anti-racist is a radical choice in the face of history, requiring a radical reorientation of our consciousness. So I'd love to hear you all's thoughts about that quote, and we can also, again, consider some of the other quotes that we have gone over with the different versions of racism, from individual, interpersonal, institutional, structural, and then even last week's quote by Angela Davis referencing anti-racism more broadly.
Could you please repeat the quote about what we teach and who we teach and who said that? There were three things. I only got what we teach and who we teach.
For sure. So again, this is from an essay entitled Anatomy of a Scandal by Reginald Hildebrand.
Okay.
And the quote reads that questions about the integrity with which we teach seamlessly slide into questions about the legitimacy of what we teach, and even a few judgmental assumptions about who we teach.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. So any thoughts about the Kendi quote, or just, again, the different terms and quotes that we've talked about, or just your reaction to it in general?
I'd love to hear a sense of, he talks about it being a radical choice in the face of history. So I'd love to hear some reflections on, why we feel this is such a radical choice in the face of history.
I mean, to me, it especially you pairing it with the housing, how the student housing in this area pushed out affordable housing options. Like that kind of struck a chord with me, especially the dates you put around that, starting in the year 2000. That's the year I graduated. And I think about, like, as a student, I did 3 years on campus, 1 year off. My wife graduated in 2001. She lived 2 years off. She lived on Caldwell Street, now where Northside Elementary School has opened, which is where my children go. When we were first moving here, it was, oh, haha, our kids are going to go to school on the same street that there were keg parties that we went to in college. And then a year later, I'm definitely more aware. Oh my gosh, like just by living there, totally contributing to this displacement in our community. And that's not something that was ever on the level of consciousness in my 21, 22-year-old self, and wouldn't be now, even if I weren't kind of back in this community, seeing what another 20 years of that has done. And so it does kind of invite me to revisit that narrative of what my college years were like. And I never would have said, oh, it, I'm a racist, but I was contributing to something that was displacing people of color. And that is kind of a radical reorientation going on in my mind and heart. And anyway, this stuff is so insidious. I don't even know you're participating in it.
Chris, you referenced that there are, to what Jared is saying, that there were already restrictions in neighborhoods of what it means to limit it to families, or how you were describing that. Do those restrictions, were they not in place for the North Side neighborhood? Those same protections not in place for that neighborhood? And why would that be?
That's a good question. And I would say, so I would definitely reference, and I know Jen and I talked about this or emailed about this offline, a colleague, Dolores Bailey, with Empowerment, because like that whole organization kind of came about for that reason. But the sad reality is, from what I understand, even with ordinances, again, remember, the town is created to serve the university, right? So in hindsight, since in that in 2000 year actually was my class year too, right? So I was starting to understand that people who are in that world of developing, real estate, have also been, leaders of the university, right? So be it trustees, or so you kind of understand, even if there are ordinances, you still recognize the way in which you move to get things done, for profit's sake. And so, and back to Justin's comments about, wealthy men in the past, like, it was Orange County men's wealth who brought the university here. And even through today, a lot of the development is, it's skillful with just understanding the ways, and the fact that the university can also help to impact, even if it's just a handful of people, how ordinances are set up. So unfortunately, even with those being said, it's Northside it's still an issue. And so this is something that I'm glad again that Lisa referenced, that I think we can begin to look at some putting more pressure on these types of ideas so that we can not displace the very people who have been here for generations, who can't afford to live here.
Right. And I think Michael had mentioned to us in a previous week that, at the peak census, the African American community, for instance, in Chapel Hill, was around 30%, 30 something percent. And now we're at about 7%, I think, of the Chapel Hill population. I mean, so this just goes to show how greatly impacted, and a lot of that has been Northside, so how greatly impacted this community has been related to housing.
Well, and there's a similar narrative going on off of Rogers Road too. And that used to be all African American, and now it's slowly, there are developments springing up off of it left and right, and it's becoming a very popular place for white folks to move. Chris, do you know anything about the Marion Cheek Jackson Center and the influence that it's had on developing the North Side community politically, for lack of a better term, organizing?
So the best way I can describe that is I'm definitely aware of it, but I will say that a mentor of mine who has lived here her whole life and family's been here for at least a couple of generations, who's African American, shared that the way that even came about was viewed as problematic by a good number of Black members of the community, as far as it being somewhat of a, the university, I think, faculty member that was attached to it, and I don't know the name, and so I don't have a reason to to try to disparage anyone because I don't know them, but it's this is why we're doing what we're doing. Like, it's easy to want to save something that you're not aware of, that you haven't done the work to learn about. And I will also say, with a little risk involved, that the connection with groups like self-help, like, again, it sounds great, but I have friends that are African American that work there, and they're not there anymore for a reason. Like, there's something to be said for trying to assist, and then there's also something to be said for using it as a means to make money off of and to exploit. I know Rob made some really powerful statements last week about athletics as well. Like, I think we have to do what we're doing now. We have to step back and start looking at the roots and understand that just because it sounds like a good idea doesn't necessarily mean that it is, especially when you ask the very people who you're supposed to be helping, ask them what they want as opposed to telling them what they want. And so there's definitely some racial scar tissue with that situation. I have heard recently that the new exec director is African American, which is somewhat of a good sign, but there's just a lot of that type of saviorism and commandeering that happens, just like lots of university towns. We're not different, but that's just our story here. But I knew that question was coming, so I appreciate it. I was just trying to think about how I was going to respond respectfully.
Well, so getting back to the question about to be anti-racist is a radical choice. Part of the choice is to commit to learning. Part of it also that's not choice is just, if there are enough people who are reshaping the narrative, then just by being in the mix, we start to be aware of things that we weren't otherwise aware of before. So part of, I guess for me personally, I am choosing to listen, to place myself in places where I will hear the story of others, who are different from me, but I'm also grateful for the fact that the overall stew in which I sit, or whatever the metaphor does, is changing enough that I am becoming aware of things just by dwelling that I wouldn't otherwise be aware of. That I'm not necessarily choosing all of it, but some of it's, and so that is empowering to the other part of me that is choosing to be as anti-racist as I can be at this point, because I'm aware that I'm part of that overall narrative that might be affecting other people who aren't making the choice, but who are just dwelling. Is that, so, and then back on the Marion T. Jackson Center and self-help and all of that, um, you know, if we could rewrite history and go back to 10 years or 20 years or whatever, what would it have taken to do it differently? And are we better off because at least those two organizations or others like them were doing something? Whereas if they weren't doing those things, it would have been even worse. I don't know. We can't rewrite history, but I guess starting from here, how do we do these things differently? Is a little bit of good better than no good?
Thinking about Kendi's statement again about given our history, being an anti-racist is a radical choice. To really simplify the sweep of history, especially in our community, I mean, for years, many of the citizens here were just clearly racist. Then we moved into a period where if those of us who weren't blatantly racist described ourselves as not racist. But to be an anti-racist, it seems to me, is to put on a new set of lenses and perhaps hearing aids where we look at everything differently and try to see through different eyes and hear through different ears how this really affects people. And I think this housing issue is a good example of that. If we just see ourselves as not being racist, we don't see the problem with college kids moving into this neighborhood. It's where the rents are cheap. Most of us did that during college. But if we're anti-racist, we see the destruction of an intact community. And because of that, we can see ourselves becoming anti-racist if we see that. I guess you can look at the word radical has its roots in the word root. So we have to enter different root understandings of what's going on by putting on these new lenses, it seems to me.
Go ahead,
for
Rob.
Sorry, Matt. For white people have to acknowledge privilege, have to see how they've experienced privilege, have to be willing to give it up. And a part of that is seeing communities that we haven't seen, because part of privilege is we just don't have to look. And so it's just another version of what Wes and Lisa was saying. We have to see completely differently. My question about anti-racism is, what's the goal? Because based on how Lisa said it or Wes said it or I just said it, for white people who have lived with privilege to become an opponent of racism or to advocate for racial justice and racial harmony is an intentional effort that a lot of white people outside of progressive towns like Chapel Hill aren't interested in making. They're interested in jumping from slavery to I'm colorblind. And so if the goal is, I don't know what the goal is. I don't know. I don't have a right answer to the question I'm asking. But I know these conversations we're having, a lot of white people aren't interested in. And I don't know how to work for a conversion. People that I went to elementary school and high school with that I've either had to tune out on Facebook or decide how much I want to argue, knowing that it's just like two two rams butting heads, but there's never going to be any progress. So I'm curious, Chris, what's the goal? What's the end game of anti-racism? Because I want to use my platform to work for harmony and to give opportunities and to understand what giving up my own privilege looks like.
That's a great question. And I'll punt to Matt and then I'll respond.
I was just going to add another layer of connecting the dots here between something that Lisa said and what Wes said and this whole conversation. So Lisa brought up Rogers Road, and it just brings to mind, and Lisa talked about the developments that are now expanding there, which are going to price people out of people who have lived there historically. Why are developments being built there now? Because people worked really hard to fight the environmental injustice of that area. People organized for years to push back against the environmental injustice and environmental racism of what was taking place in that area. And as soon as you get some progress towards victory on that front, now the people who have done the hard grassroots work of that are going to get priced out of their homes. And now it's housing injustice. And so the way that all of this is just wrapped up together, and I love Wes's point about the word radical coming from radix, root. It goes all the way down to the root, and we're gonna have to keep digging and to get to the roots, and then also to see the way that all of these things are entangled, overlapped, all connected together.
Matt, that's a really great point. And I'm loving how we're starting to see connections in our comments and we're moving towards something. And I would say, honestly, Rob, to answer your question, it's really up to us because every local community is different, right? And like, so we get to decide, just even, this group in these communities, how do we want to be anti-racist in this community beyond the buzzword and everyone's excited about it, but as some of the students I've talked to recently that are Morehead Kane scholars, one incoming student who's, I'm like, wow, I can't wait to see her in a few years. Like she says, it's a lifelong thing. It's not a moment. It's and I know Justin said it, Michael has said it, but I will say, and you said convergence, and that's what made me think of so critical race theory, I mentioned towards a critical race theory last time when we talked about the multicultural paradigm. So that field, it came out of the law field out of Harvard. And so Derek Bell was the one that coined the term. And he basically talks about an interest convergence. And that's what you're talking about. We have to find an interest convergence for people who we think don't want to be a part of it. But I'll argue that, we've heard that the personal is political and the political is personal. I grew up in a very conservative part of Virginia. Gloucester is close to Williamsburg, Busch Gardens. And I will say that I have friends that definitely vote differently than me, but because we have a personal connection, they're willing to listen. So even though we think that people aren't willing to listen, sometimes I actually say I can stomach their more bald racism than I can stomach the hidden racism in progressive places. Like I would rather know what I'm getting than to not know what I'm getting and to get stabbed. So like, I think there are ways, Facebook and those things are not, they are ways that people show, but when we're past this time and we're in more personal kind of connection, people generally, if it's personal and there's a biracial grandchild all of a sudden, or there's some people have connection to these things more so than we want to admit. And I think that, again, we have a way to shape that as a community. And I would love to hear other people's thoughts about how you think we could do that, here in our community.
So I'd just share a word about, two images about what it means to be anti-racist. And Chris, I really appreciated, what you said about this continual effort. So being anti-racist is kind of like buying a car, whether it's new or used. If you buy a car, all of a sudden you see that car everywhere. You think, how does everybody else have this car? How have I not noticed this car everywhere on the road? And so you begin to see racism all over the place, and it very quickly becomes exhausting. And so many folks who have entered into this kind of awakening will share this with me. So many of my white friends, and so my response is generally something like, God will give you the strength to continue to press, but welcome to the struggle. Like, now that your eyes are open, welcome to the struggle. You're never going to see differently. It's not like this is. And so the second image I would use, and I know many of us either are or have hosted recovery communities at our places of worship. So being an anti-racist is also recovering from the addiction to racism that our country has. And so it's going to be a life thing. You're constantly going to be celebrating the month chip you got, and then the year, and then the 10-year. I mean, it's a life thing, because it'll take constant work. It's not like we're going to wake up one day this side of eternity and say, okay, well, we've finished. There's no more anti-racist work to be done. It is the awakening. The awakening is to the sense that now I can see it, and now because I can see it, because I can talk about it better, and because I can't ignore it anymore. Now I can actually work, and this work is going to be the work of a lifetime.
Jim Wallace refers to slavery as Americans' original sin. And in that sense, that original sin is always going to be with us. It's always going to be pushing against us and encouraging us to move to the bottom rather than to the top. And it's always going to have to be, it seems to me, an ongoing struggle. When I think about what can we do to be effective, it seems to me that one of the things that we can do, especially in this community, is to make sure that policies that we adopt, either in the university or in the town, are policies that are developed with input and result in anti-racist policies. And sometimes it's going to have to be explaining to people why this is a policy that's proposed is in a real sense a racist policy, and to push back against that. We know from some of the data that came out of the 60s and civil rights law is that attitudes change when laws change. And so better policy will help push anti-racist attitudes along, or so it seems to me.
This gets back to what I've been saying about my own confession on behalf of the advocate for wanting to employ or hire African-American businesses, but then ending up going to the default of the network that we have. Any of this work is going to take, we have to be ready to take more time, to be more patient, to not necessarily be expedient. And, some of us are just wired to want to get things done. And in others, we have pressures from outside to get things done in a certain amount of time. And I guess I'm increasingly aware of how much time it takes and how time, I'd be curious to see how COVID affects our attitudes towards time, but time is such a thing, expediency is a thing. Time is money, right? All that. So that's part of the commitment, I think, to being anti-racist, is being willing to take time to do things with anti-racism as a goal or in mind, in heart.
And to respond quickly, actually, Jen, you go ahead. You go ahead.
I'm sorry for the disruption back here, but one of the things that I just keep coming to is this profound sense of humility, like the 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 scope of my knowledge, um, the limitations of my experience, and just recognizing that the world is structured differently um, than I was raised in part to believe. And like Justin said, that once you start, I was thinking like when you're pregnant and you start noticing like everybody that's pregnant, that they're only Lisa and I will be able to relate to that right now. But I thought that was a great image, because once you start to loosen your grip on a construct of the world and your place in it, that has helped you kind of make sense. Once you loosen your grip on that and start to open to other realities, and how this whole culture is predicated on white privilege, right? It's it's like opening up to this huge collage when you just saw a drawing with you at the center. you know it's overwhelming. So I'm gonna mute quickly before you guys get more of Ocarina.
If I could just add one more note, one of my favorite lines in all of Christian scripture is the story of the Ethiopian eunuch in the book of Acts. And when he's asked, do you realize what you're reading? He's reading the ancient scriptures. And he says, how can I know unless someone teach me or unless someone guide me? And I receive that as both acceptance of my own lack of knowledge, because I can't know until I'm taught. And then also for me to claim my own mantle as teacher, and to be patient with those who don't yet know, because no one has taught them.
And I really am glad that you all said what you said, because I was trying to think about if I should say this. But because we're in a group of communities of faith, I was going to say although all the things we said are true, right? It's not going anywhere anytime soon. One of the things that I was encouraged with by grandparents' generation in particular is that, for the afterlife, we're gonna all be together anyway, right? So we need to get used to it. Like, I mean, everyone has different views of it, right? But if it's gonna look like the world, like, people are gonna be shocked, including those in our communities, if we don't get it right. If we can, that's the motivation. Let's just get prepared for what it's gonna be like in that time, if that can be some sort of consolation. To Wes's point about policy, and I've already thought about questions for our next conversation, because I was excited about it. But policy is definitely important. That's part of what I'm studying, right? But I think the other thing that I wanted to pivot to our next question about is definitely custom, because like I think the pendulum can go in different directions. And I think when we think about the reason why critical race theory emerged is because it was critical of the ways that we went about the law piece, because as you know now, those same ways of looking at law is being used as reverse affirmative action. Like it's law can often be manipulated in whatever way we want to. So I want to kind of switch to a custom question, or like how we do things in our personal lives. Like Apple Chill is a perfect example of this, right? Like the unspoken racial considerations, especially for those of you who were here when it was going on, undergird these contributing factors. I would love to hear your thoughts about how that basically ended, because I think that's an example of families, and it's something that's like, it's not policy, it's just us going out and having, washing the cloggers and having some food. Like, what are people's thoughts about how it came to an end? And for those who don't know, feel free to ask questions, because I only went to one thing and I'll save my comment for later. But I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts about that, when I mentioned how high cost violence and heavy traffic were listed, but there's clearly some racial underpinnings to those statements.
Yeah.
So I hadn't arrived yet, but my cousins grew up here and went to East Chapel Hill, and they used to go a lot and were pretty frustrated when it ended. And the talk that I heard was that it ended because black biker gangs drove into Chapel Hill and killed somebody. That's what I was told.
Yeah, I grew up here, and during that time, and the thought that struck me as you were listing those purposes for it being shut down, Chris, was the question of, then why didn't we close down Halloween? Um, what they did was they responded. The community responded. I think there used to be like 80,000 or something. I'm pulling that number from deep recesses, so I could be wrong on that, but some kind of number like that for what Halloween used to be on Franklin Street. And they didn't shut it down. They made adjustments. And why would we make adjustments for something that's primarily young college students? And we've already talked about what the makeup of the college is. Why wouldn't they take the same approach towards Apple Chill? We, not they.
Any other thoughts before I share my personal story?
I mean, I would simply agree with what everybody had said. I think Apple Chill ended around, was it 2006? Was it? So I was here in my first iteration as an associate pastor at University Church, and I do remember, kind of paying attention to it. But essentially, yes. I mean, the sense that, um, these black folks come into town, and my gosh, if this is going to happen, if there's going to be violence, we got to shut this thing down. And I think it kind of plays into these typical tropes that we see. So, in Chapel Hill, we talk about, so even Halloween, so this spectacle that is Halloween. So, what do? We keep folks from bussing in from Durham. So we speak of Durham like other people speak of the inner city. And what's that really code for, right? So just this concern for, what happens when, groups of black folks come in from out of town, and how we and it goes into this sense of like how we assume that if there are too many black bodies in one place, it creates the great possibility for violence. And so just watch on social media as there's all this stir about the Marxist, communist, Black Lives Matter organization, and it's always very often paired with some threat of violence. And this is, I mean, I think this is part of what's entirely problematic is what we assume about any place that has a density of black bodies, in the sense that violence must ensue, and we must change quickly to avoid it.
So this is a good example of how race and racism impacts even people within the within and between group dynamics within like African Americans or whites or whomever. So again, I grew up near Williamsburg, very very white community, very rural, very conservative. So when I came to Carolina in '96, I was going to McDonald's during Apple Chill, didn't know what was going on. It was in the evening, right? And as I walked farther down the street, West Franklin, I was like, what's happening? Like, in all the other time, I've never seen any number of African American people, especially who didn't go to the campus. And I was like, I don't know what's happening. Like, this is very odd to me. Like, I mean, I wasn't necessarily afraid per se, but I definitely was like, something seems wrong here because this this shouldn't be happening. And so just as a personal confession that we are also impacted by this too, right? We hold some of these same. We have to work out our own um, internal issues with how we view ourselves and our groups. So And I found out, so, I had to figure out, like, what's going on? I asked my girl, I said, oh yeah, this is like the after part. I don't know if they call it after chill, but what I would say is that quote that was mentioned by like I think a travel like writer or whatever, he called it an unsanctioned event. So my question, what I wanted to throw out is, because we had, this thing where, these people are coming with these souped up cars and motorcycles, had that been, some of that been included as a sanctioned event, could that have helped to keep what happened? Because in 2006, I actually was in Durham, and I'm glad that you mentioned that, Jessica, because I know that Lisa mentioned that too. And some of my students, when I was over there, talked about, they were running because they were shooting, and so whenever people are excluded again from events, people are going to make up their own stuff, right? So like if it had some of that part been included in the actual daytime stuff, could that have alleviated some of the issues that were happening? So, and I wanted to definitely put with Lisa's comment about the fear of Durham, and I'll even admit, I think it might have been Hurricane Fran, even, I think in '96, I heard people talking about, I don't know if this is true or not, but there were rumors about blocking 40 or 54 at least, so that Durham people couldn't come into Chapel Hill. So like there's just all these messages again about the others coming into our community that didn't belong.
Well, and then that was all exacerbated and underscored with the murder of the young woman student, 5 years ago now? And the people who did that came over from Durham, and that was all that kind of, yeah, there we go again, people coming in from Durham.
That was 2 years after, actually, unfortunately, 2008. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
It seemed to me that the pairing of the black male with the motorcycle made it even worse because of the history, the long history of motorcycle gangs in some parts of the country. And the two just fed into one another of this vortex of prejudice, it seems to me.
Well, when you were talking a week or two ago about the young man who was killed in the pit, that was people coming in from somewhere else on motorcycles too, wasn't it?
That was actually a Chapel Hill gang, and so Michael made a good point. I do believe there were two groups called the Stormtroopers, but clearly, I mean, just to be, fair, like, we know that there are lots of issues when it comes to crime, but that situation in particular was a white gang. And from what I understand, if you just look up like James Cate's podcast, from what I understand, one of the members, his mom worked at Sutton. So like people know who it is. I don't know because I wasn't here, but it was a Chapel Hill gang that eventually takes on the name Hell's Angels. And they actually also were responsible for another question I had when I came as a freshman for University Massage, which, had lots of issues there too, being illegal, like on the front for some organized crime. So that was an interesting tie for me to learn that. But yeah, that was actually, it was a group.
Right. Sorry.
That's okay. Any other thoughts about that before I ask our last question as we start to wrap? Or any other questions that people had that didn't get a chance to mention or thoughts?
Well, I do think a lot of the pride about the Chapel Hill Public Schools is also in part connected somehow to the Durham. Why would you move to Durham? The schools there are so bad. I've lived in Durham for 30 years, so I've been curious too, because I've noticed on these calls that a number of Chapel Hill clergy live in Durham. In large part of that's because it's less expensive. And a large part of that's because of this history.
Well, I'll quickly say, having worked in Chapel and Durham schools, that one of the downfalls for Durham is that, because it's really probably a top 10 school district in the state, it's just, it has the misfortune of being, between Chapel Hill and Wake, who are very well off. So like, and honestly, elementary schools are usually pretty decent. It's just as it gets up, like we talked about with segregation academies, people start pulling their kids from middle and high school because they don't want them to go to, there's this thought that, the schools are not as good. So, but as you all know, Durham it's not what it was. So it's, that fear is still there, but it's not what it was historically. And so, and to that same point, I wanted to ask, with respect to our robust conversation last week about sports, like when Taylor Branch is using, phrases like plantation and well-meaning paternalists and the colonized, and this is a good question to kind of let sit and we can talk about more because it's such a big part of our community here. But like, I love how people keep using the radically reorient language. So how can we radically reorient our consciousness as it relates to college sports in our local community? I know we already kind of got into that with the Michael Jordan conversation last week. And Rob, I wanted to mention to you while we were together that he shared in his Hall of Fame speech that a lot of his lack of statement was tied into his contract that he signed. So, and again, we can speculate on whether or not he should have gone against it anyway, but a lot of that was not necessarily his own doing. But I just want to throw that in there, especially because, again, and I like to say, out loud that, Central and Duke would have these secret games and Central would win. So like, there's a lot of, and again, the four corners I said, like last time, it came from the Central coach. It wasn't Dean Smith, and he actually says that, but there's a lot of telling and retelling that we have to do for it to get out about the truth about that. So yeah, any thoughts about how we radically reorient our consciousness, especially given this upcoming year where we may not have, we may not have a season like we have had given the current pandemic. So any thoughts about that and how it kind of connects into our culture as a community?
I'm going to just show my humility because people made fun of me because 4 or 5 years ago, I didn't know the difference between the ACC and the Final Four. So I'm really not the best one for this question. But I mean, just knowing that we brought the football team back to practice and gave everybody tests, everybody's negative for COVID. Within 2 weeks, 37 players have fallen ill, right? So to me, that's a very immediate example of, what are we valuing? So, but other people have to talk about basketball.
Chris, I think it's a good example to go with your other ones about the town festival and the reasons of cost and housing policy. And then you also talked about the labor force at the university, that there are all of these deeply entrenched economic interests, and those who control the flow of those economic resources are entrenched in patterns of racializing power. And so it's just a very good example of a deep systemic problem. And your original question about a radical choice to be anti-racist is just a very good observation and a long-term struggle. These are, the real power players in Chapel Hill and North Carolina, business, economics, government, education. And so it's a very knotty situation. KNOTTY, like a knot.
Well, the other may apply as well, though.
I was really frustrated when there was the whole academic scandal with the African Studies program for athletes. And my particular frustration about it, which I tried to talk to people here at church about, a lot of them who are season ticket holders, who their biggest concern is, will the Tar Heels win the national championship in basketball? Will they win more games than they lose in football? African and African American studies could be such a powerful education thread where we would learn some of the history that would dispel the myths that when you see a bunch of black guys walking together, you need to be terrified and protect the women and children and lock your car doors. I mean, that's the myth. African American studies could dispel that if it was a serious academic program. And so I wanted to hear Roy Williams and whoever was the football coach at the time come out and say, all of my success is based on tremendous black athletes. I value an African-American program, that studies program, that would dispel the myths that perpetuate white privilege and a lot of the lies that are believed about race. And none of that conversation happened. It was all about how can we protect the eligibility of the basketball program and make sure we don't lose the 2005 championship and the 2009 championship. And we cannot tilt the halo on the same team. That cannot happen. And the people I was having these arguments with were professors at UNC, people who build their own lives around the academics. But I don't want my basketball coach worried about an academic program. I want him to keep Rashad McCants eligible. And I don't want to hear the story later that McCants was carrying a C average and then all of a sudden, boom, he's got all A's. And we win the 2005 championship. And nobody wanted to have that conversation. And certainly we weren't hearing it from the university. It was, how do we protect our records? And it was really frustrating. Now it's easy for me because I'm not a Carolina fan. I'm not a big fan either. I'm from the Midwest. Provided me lots of disappointment over the years. But just at a purely academic level, which is what UNC is supposed to be, the flagship university of the high point of public education in North Carolina. And what's our big concern? To protect those championships. Come on, this is a golden moment in this conversation, and we're just going to totally skip it. And as you can tell, this was very frustrating for me at the time. So thanks for peeling the scab off that wound, Chris. I really appreciate it. But a personal note for me about consciousness is in 2009 and then 2011, my wife and I adopted kids from Ethiopia. So we were all of a sudden parents of a black son and black daughter. And around that time, there were kids going through our neighborhood. They're high school football players. They were selling calendars because their coach told them to go raise money for the football team. So a couple of white kids from Chapel Hill High did that. The next week, there were two black kids from players from Carborough High. And someone in our neighborhood sent out an email to the listserv that said there are black men going door to door in the neighborhood, should I call the police? My wife called the lady and said, if you see my black son playing in the yards, do not call the police. He lives here. That was a telling moment. When Trayvon Martin was killed and we adopted our kids, all of a sudden I realized, oh, wow, that could be my son. And so conversations having about what might happen when you get your driver's license. Now I have to teach that to a son, and I never had to learn it. I mean, my brother and I argued with police officers. And now I gotta teach my son, hey, I need you to survive that encounter, and you'll probably be pulled over, and you probably didn't do anything wrong. So for me, that's a consciousness. It has changed how I see everything. And I don't know everybody's feelings about white people adopting black kids. There's different feelings about that, and I just have to live with whatever anybody's feelings are about that because it's done. But sorry, I've been talking a long time. You finally hit my play button here, so I'm going to mute.
That's good though, man. Thanks for sharing. It's powerful.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think Barry underscored what you're saying, Rob, about like why people weren't talking. And, you know, it's, yeah, I just, I will say that I'm hopeful because I referenced this kind of quickly last time, but I'll go in and say a little more clearly that the idea of the way that college sports is done, the amateurism myth is not, it won't hold because the NBA a few months ago, has a new uh, concept where the top 30 players in the country in the G League can be paid up to or $500,000 as a base. And then also, if they go to Arizona State, which I'm trying to figure out what that's about, they'll pay for their college. So, you know, the days of what we've seen before won't be able to last. And I'll also say, as a graduate, I was history and African American studies. I was afraid, at one point, whenever all of the disparagement, to even share that was one of my degrees. On a couple of, I whitened my resume on a couple of occasions, and I hate to admit that, but I'd be a hypocrite if I didn't. So there's a lot with that. But even to your point, I think we said earlier about when it's personal, like when you do, Black children, particularly Black boys, they need love from wherever they can get it, loving homes. And so that's just my own personal opinion. Of course, the Black family had been dismantled from the beginning, and so there's lots of reasons why, lots of historical reasons why we show up in the foster system disproportionately. But I will say that those are the entry points, I think, in having conversations with people that don't normally want to talk about these issues, is when it's their friend from high school, or like when there's a personal connection, that's a little easier, and you don't even necessarily have to say it. Just like we talk about, I think it was in individual or institutional race isn't said, it's just kind of done for advantage. You don't have to say it when you're doing this anti-racism work. You can just, as long as you're getting it, you have to kind of know who you're talking to, and just and work with all the things that they bring to the conversation, and be wise. So but I wanted to also, just if there were any other last thoughts before we wrap, and then we'll have our one of our conclusion conversations next week, and it sounds like we'll be having a few more. So any other last thoughts that people wanted to say?
I keep thinking about Wes making that connection between the word radical and root, and I think that's so important. And as faith leaders, coming from different faith traditions, we do have that shared root. If we follow our root back to the story of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar, then we see that a description of a God who sees and hears. And part of this radical reorientation, this root reorientation of an awakening of our own consciousness, is that God teaches us to see and to hear. And that's part of our role in this community, is to teach our community to see and to hear. You hear that over and over again, the refrain of the prophets, of eyes to see and ears to hear. And so I think that's part of our historic role as faith leaders, is to, if a political leader is constantly appealing to the base, then we're doing the opposite and appealing to the highest common denominator. And I think that's part of our role, is to be a part of that awakening, of that radical reorientation of consciousness for our community to see and to hear. And it starts with us experiencing that ourselves.
Yeah, Matt, you do a good job of tying both. I appreciate that statement. That was a really, I don't want to mess it up by saying anymore. So, but yeah, I look forward to a conversation next week about a beginning conversation about where do we go from here. We definitely won't have all the answers in one session. So just thank everybody. Thank everyone for your time, and look forward to next week.